Cold light crept over the wire fences, touching the frost that clung to every surface and settling along the narrow paths worn into the frozen ground. The camp rose slowly, as if waking came with a cost. Breath hung in the air, drifting like pale smoke from prisoners and guards alike. Nothing moved quickly in the morning chill, not even hope. She tried to stand before the count began, bracing one hand against the rough wall of the barracks. Her legs trembled beneath her, thin from hunger and too many days spent conserving strength she no longer had. For a moment she managed to lift herself, rising halfway before the cold and exhaustion combined into a single breaking point. Then her knees gave out. Her body folded, collapsing silently onto the hard earth. The sound was small, a soft thud swallowed by the frozen ground, yet it cut through the morning like an alarm. 2 American soldiers nearby froze mid-step. One lowered the clipboard in his hand, unsure whether he had witnessed an injury, a fainting spell, or something born of fear. The other shifted his weight, but did not approach. They had learned that sudden movement sometimes made things worse. Around her, the women standing in line stiffened. Their eyes widened, not in surprise, but in dread. No one spoke. No one reached for her. They watched with their hands pressed to their sides, their postures tall and rigid as if any gesture might bring punishment. The air tightened with their fear, more palpable than the cold. The soldiers exchanged a quiet glance, both understanding there was more beneath this moment than simple weakness. Her collapse was not just physical. It was protective, desperate, shaped by something they could not yet see. She lay still, breathing in shallow bursts, waiting for a reaction they did not give. The question rose unspoken in the morning silence, carried in every stare and every trembling breath. Why was she so terrified of accepting help? The women gathered close after the collapse, their movements small and controlled, as if the cold itself demanded silence. Breath steamed between them as they knelt beside the fallen woman without touching her, whispering words shaped by years of warnings. Their hands trembled not only from the weather, but from memories carried across borders and battle lines, old lessons resurfacing in the stillness of dawn. They spoke of things taught long before captivity, stories passed from older sisters, teachers, and mothers who believed danger lived in every foreign gesture. Strength meant survival. Weakness meant being cast aside. A woman who faltered risked punishment, separation, or disappearance. Some whispered that captors removed the frail first, not out of mercy, but for reasons no one dared to finish aloud. These myths clung to them as tightly as their thin coats, filling every pause with dread. One woman lifted her shaking hand and set it on the ground beside the fallen prisoner, close, but not touching. Touching would show loyalty. Touching might be seen as interference. Even compassion felt dangerous under the weight of those old fears. They leaned closer, murmuring warnings she could barely hear. Stay still, do not accept help, do not meet their eyes. Trusting the wrong gesture could separate them forever. Across the yard, the American soldiers remained steady and quiet. One adjusted his scarf against the wind. Another checked the distance between them and the prisoners, careful not to step forward too soon. Their calm movement softened nothing. To the women, calmness only meant unreadable intentions. The contrast deepened the tension. The soldiers saw someone fainting from hunger and cold. The prisoners saw a moment that might end in disappearance. The woman on the ground tried to breathe normally, her chest rising and falling with fragile rhythm, while the others whispered fear into the cold morning air. These were warnings taught long before the war ended, warnings that shaped every reaction now, making safety look indistinguishable from danger. In their eyes, accepting help was not rescue. It was risk. The sergeant stood a short distance from the group, boots planted in the frozen dirt, breath drifting upward in thin clouds. He did not move toward the collapsed woman. He only watched, letting the stillness settle between them. Her trembling reached him even from where he stood, a faint shaking that traveled through her shoulders and along her arms as she tried to steady herself. Each breath she took was shallow, held for a moment, then released with the quiet desperation of someone afraid even to inhale too loudly. He shifted his gaze to the women surrounding her. Their posture told him far more than their silence did. None reached out to lift her. None called for help. Their hands hovered over her body, but never made contact, as if touch itself might bring consequences they were unwilling to face. The fear that passed between them was not momentary. It was practiced, ingrained, deep. Even in the open air, it felt tightly contained, like something long rehearsed. The sergeant let the wind move past him while he studied the pattern of their reactions. He saw the quick glances toward his men, the way shoulders stiffened whenever a soldier shifted weight or adjusted a rifle strap. They feared the simple act of being noticed, and that fear spread through the group like an invisible thread pulled taut, binding them together in shared tension. Orders told him to check for injuries, to make sure the camp remained stable and safe. But compassion tugged at the decision, urging him to wait, to watch, to learn something first. Rushing in would only deepen whatever terror already lived inside them. He could see that much clearly. He lowered his hand from his belt, choosing stillness over authority. Patience, he realized, might be the only bridge they could accept. The collapsed woman struggled for another breath, and the sergeant felt the conflict press against his chest. Duty demanding action, humanity demanding restraint. So he remained where he was, steady, quiet, letting them see that he would not force the moment. They remembered the lessons long before they remembered safety. Even as the camp wind brushed against their faces, their thoughts drifted back to the classrooms, basements, and ruined kitchens where those warnings had first been whispered. The teachings had come in fragments, sometimes from officers, sometimes from terrified neighbors, sometimes from mothers who believed fear was a form of protection. Foreign soldiers, they had been told, did not distinguish between prisoners and burdens. Anyone who faltered, anyone who failed to stand, could be taken away without a word. The women carried those lessons like invisible bindings. The idea that inability to walk meant disappearance had settled deep into their instincts, shaping every reaction long before reason could intervene. Even now, as the sergeant stood still and silent, they watched him through the lens of those memories, expecting consequences for every tremor in their limbs. The collapse of one among them did not draw sympathy. It triggered the old warnings. If she could not rise, she could be removed. If they helped her, they could be marked as weak as well. Shame lived close to their skin. It had been taught not as emotion, but as discipline, a standard pressed into them by war and scarcity. To show weakness was to place a burden on the group. To admit injury was to risk punishment, separation, or loss of dignity. So they hid everything: sprains, fever, hunger, fear, until their bodies betrayed them despite their best efforts. War had conditioned them to survive by disguise. Limping became a controlled step. Pain became silence. Exhaustion became lowered eyes. And when their legs finally failed, as hers had, the collapse felt like a personal failing, not a human limit. That belief gripped them tighter than the cold ever could. Even now, surrounded by soldiers who showed no sign of aggression, the instinct held. They waited for judgment, for removal, for the consequence that had always followed weakness in the ruins they once called home. The soldiers moved carefully at first, unsure whether her collapse came from hunger, injury, or simple exhaustion. One of them stepped forward with a canteen, its metal catching a faint glint from the morning light. Another soldier unfolded a blanket, holding it out with both hands, as if presenting something fragile. Their gestures were slow, deliberate, shaped more by concern than command. But the moment the woman saw the motion, panic rippled through her. Her palms scraped against the dirt as she pushed herself backward, legs trembling, breath sharp and uneven. She dragged herself away in a frantic crawl, her eyes wide with the terror of someone expecting punishment rather than help. The blanket, soft, warm, harmless, might as well have been a threat. Every inch the soldiers moved forward made her shrink further into herself, as though her body still obeyed rules from another world entirely. The other women reacted instantly. They closed ranks around her without speaking, creating a living barrier between her and the approaching soldiers. Their hands hovered protectively over her shoulders and arms, shielding her with the same instinct that once guarded children and families back home. None of them raised their voices, yet the tension deepened, thick as the cold air swirling between both groups. The soldiers froze, caught between duty and the fear unfolding before them. They exchanged quiet glances, realizing the tools they brought, water, warmth, relief, had arrived too soon, too close. The sergeant lifted a hand, signaling his men to stop. The canteen lowered. The blanket hung motionless. In that pause, understanding settled over them like a slow dawn. Help was not the problem. Proximity was. Whatever history these women carried, whatever warnings shaped their reactions, it was clear that trust had been broken long before this morning. And trust, they realized, would have to be earned, patiently, quietly, and on the women's terms. The sergeant lifted his hand again, but this time the gesture carried no urgency, no command, only restraint. The soldiers understood immediately. One by one, they stepped back, boots pressing softly into the cold earth, widening the space between themselves and the frightened circle of women. The shift was subtle but decisive, a silent acknowledgement that closeness had become a barrier rather than a bridge. As the distance grew, the air itself seemed to loosen. The tension that had gripped the ground between them, tight, cold, almost vibrating, began to thin. The women held their protective circle a moment longer, shoulders stiff, breath shallow. But when the soldiers retreated far enough, that their shadows no longer reached her. Something inside that fragile space changed. The collapsed woman's trembling slowed first. Her hands, still planted in the dirt, no longer clawed for escape. Her back rose and fell in uneven breaths, each one steadier than the last. The other women watched her carefully, unsure if she would faint again or attempt to flee, but they sensed the softness settling into the moment. For the first time since she fell, she lifted her head. It wasn't much, barely a few inches, but the motion carried the weight of a small, brave defiance against everything she had been taught. Her eyes, still glossy with fear, tracked the soldiers from afar. They were distant now, little more than silhouettes framed against the washed-out morning light. They made no move toward her. No gestures, no demands. She watched them in cautious stillness, and then, almost accidentally, her gaze found the sergeant's. He stood apart from his men, posture lowered, hands empty, breath held as if any sudden movement might break this fragile moment. The eye contact lasted only a heartbeat, thin, quiet, trembling, but it was the first connection not built from fear. For the soldiers, it was barely noticeable. For her, it was the beginning of something new. The wind shifted just enough to lift the edge of her tattered cloth, and for a moment the morning light slipped beneath it. What had been hidden under layers of dirt and careful positioning came into view. Pale skin stretched thin from hunger, faint bruises fading into one another like old shadows, the outline of ribs rising with each unsteady breath. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was simply the quiet truth of a body pushed far past its limits. The women closest to her noticed the reveal immediately. One reached to pull the cloth back into place, but the movement came too late. The sergeant had already seen. He did not flinch outwardly. His jaw didn't tighten. His shoulders didn't rise. No sympathetic words slipped out. But something in his eyes shifted, just enough that anyone looking closely would see the depth of what he was holding back. He had expected fear, exhaustion, maybe even defiance. He had not expected this kind of frailty, the kind born from months of deprivation, rather than a single moment of collapse. He forced his gaze downward for a breath, steadying himself before he met the scene again. His training demanded calm, but compassion pressed against the barrier of discipline, asking for a place to rise. He watched her try to adjust the cloth with trembling fingers, desperate to hide what had been exposed, desperate to hold on to whatever dignity she believed she had left. Inside him, a conflict deepened. He knew he couldn't move closer. Not yet. Any attempt to help would only drive her deeper into fear. But doing nothing, standing frozen while she struggled, felt just as wrong. The other soldiers looked to him, waiting for direction, but he offered none. He simply let the moment breathe, allowing her time to gather herself without interference. Respect, he realized, might be the first medicine she would accept from them. And in the faint lift of her chin, in the small attempt to compose herself, he sensed the smallest thread of trust beginning to form. They brought the stretcher quietly, carrying it as if any sharp movement might shatter the fragile calm that had settled over the camp. No orders were spoken. No gestures urged the women to move aside. The soldiers simply lowered the canvas frame onto the cold ground, letting its wooden legs sink slightly into the dirt. Then, As if rehearsed, they stepped back, 3 paces, then 4, until there was a clear space between them and the women who shielded her. Their retreat was deliberate, almost ceremonial. It signaled something far more meaningful than the offer of help. It signaled restraint. It signaled respect. The women hesitated at first, glancing between the stretcher and the soldiers who now stood in a loose line, hands lowered, shoulders soft. When no threat followed, when no command rose in the air, they leaned closer to her. One touched her shoulder lightly. Another steadied her elbow. She didn't recoil this time. Exhaustion had worn through her fear, but something gentler had begun to work beneath that exhaustion. An understanding that no force pressed toward her now. She tried to rise, failed, and leaned into the hands that supported her. The movement was slow, uneven, but willingly given. They guided her toward the stretcher with careful steps, each woman adjusting her grip so she wouldn't feel pushed or exposed. When she finally lowered herself onto the canvas, her breath slipped out in a trembling sigh, half relief, half surrender to the moment. From a distance, the Americans watched with quiet attention. No one moved forward. No one hurried the process. The sergeant simply observed the scene unfold as the women tucked blankets around her and shielded her from the wind. For the first time that morning, help did not frighten her. It shaped itself through hands she trusted, guided by men who understood they could not touch her to lift her, and chose instead to let dignity do the lifting. They waited for the signal, not from an officer, but from the women gathered around her. The soldiers remained still, their boots rooted to the ground, watching as the women whispered among themselves. One of the older prisoners looked up first. Her eyes were tired but steady, carrying the weight of a choice she never expected to make in an enemy's camp. She gave a small nod, barely more than a tilt of her head. Another woman followed, then another, until the circle quietly agreed. Only then did the soldiers step forward. Their movements were slow, measured, shaped by the memory of how she had recoiled before. They approached the stretcher as if the air itself might react to haste. Kneeling at each end, they paused again, giving her room to breathe. She did not shrink away. Her fingers tightened around the blanket, but no fear pushed her backward. Her wide, uncertain eyes tracked their hands, yet her body stayed still. When they lifted, they did so with a gentleness that seemed to carry the weight of more than her frail frame. The canvas rose evenly, swaying only slightly, and she inhaled sharply, but didn't flinch. The women beside her exhaled as one, the sound soft and fragile in the cold morning air. One whispered something short, a sound closer to relief than fear. Step by step, the soldiers carried her across the yard, their pace steady, almost ceremonial. She watched the sky above her, not the hands below. For the first time, being lifted did not mean being taken. It meant being seen. It meant being protected. Behind them, the prisoners followed slowly, murmuring in quiet awe at a moment that, for the first time since captivity began, did not bring terror, but the faint beginning of hope. She lay on the stretcher long. After they reached the shade of the medic tent, her breath thin but steadier than before. The soldiers had stepped far back, leaving only space and quiet, and it was in that quiet that her story began to surface. Not in full sentences, not in anything strong or steady, just fragments carried on trembling breaths, shaped more by memory than by voice. She explained that fear had lived in her long before the camp. It began in the final months of the war, when every unfamiliar hand meant danger. She had learned to shrink from touch because touch often came with orders, and orders came with consequences she couldn't predict. She spoke of being told that no one would help a woman who fell behind, that weakness invited punishment, that standing meant survival, even when her legs could no longer obey. Shame had followed her through each evacuation station, each collapsed building, each abandoned road. She hid her injuries because to show them was to lose dignity. She hid her trembling because to reveal fear was to be marked as a burden. When the last march began, she walked until she couldn't, and when she finally collapsed, she thought it was the end, not of the war, of herself. She whispered about those she lost along the way, a sister who vanished during a night crossing, a friend who couldn't continue and was left behind. She carried their names like stones, pressing them into the silence around her. It wasn't just the soldiers she feared. It was the possibility that accepting help meant admitting she had survived when they had not. As she spoke, the camp seemed to soften around her, not because her pain eased, but because sharing it, finally, painfully, allowed someone else to carry a small part of what she had borne alone. The change did not arrive as a sudden revelation. It unfolded slowly, almost cautiously, like dawn light slipping across a frozen field. The woman lay on the stretcher, wrapped in a blanket she had been too frightened to accept earlier, and the camp around her began to shift in ways small enough to be missed by anyone not watching closely. Yet for those who had lived through months shaped by warnings and whispered beliefs, every inch of gentleness mattered. The myths they carried, of foreign soldiers who seized the weak, of men who punished those who fell, of hands that lifted only to harm, had been planted so deeply that fear felt like instinct. But the truth standing before them told another story. The soldiers moved with a restraint that contradicted everything the women had memorized in the ruins of their world. They approached only when invited. They stepped back when fear rose. They lifted her only when the others nodded in permission, their care measured and deliberate, turning the act of lifting into something closer to healing than harm. As the stretcher was set down gently beside the tent, the watching prisoners exchanged glances that held more uncertainty than dread. What they had witnessed challenged the architecture of their fear. The lift itself, once a symbol of danger, became the moment they could no longer reconcile rumor with reality. No harsh orders, no raised voices, no punishment disguised as aid. Only patience, only humanity. The sergeant remained still, giving them space, but his restraint spoke louder than any reassurance could. The women understood discipline. They had lived under its harsher versions. What they saw now was discipline shaped by compassion, and it unsettled everything they thought they knew. In that fragile quiet, belief began to bend. Not because the war ended, not because trust suddenly blossomed, but because one careful act had proven that even in a world built on fear, kindness could still force the truth into the open. She rested in the infirmary as morning light filtered, through thin canvas walls, settling softly over her like a second blanket. The air inside was warmer than anything she had felt in months, touched by the faint scent of boiled water and clean cloth. For the first time since her capture, she lay without bracing for footsteps or punishment, her breath rising in slow, even waves. Outside, the camp moved quietly, as if the soldiers and prisoners alike sensed the need to let the moment stand untouched. The nurses worked around her with deliberate gentleness, keeping their distance when she stirred, stepping closer only when she no longer flinched. They did not rush her body towards strength. They simply protected the space where fear had begun to loosen its hold. The other women gathered near the entrance, watching with a mix of wonder and confusion, realizing that what happened at dawn had reshaped more than a single morning. It had shifted something inside all of them. Across the world in those final months of the war, similar scenes unfolded, moments where compassion rose quietly through the wreckage. A soldier sharing water with a prisoner who once feared his uniform. A medic treating a wounded enemy child with the same care he would offer his own. Small gestures that carried no glory and earned no recognition, yet became the threads that held humanity together when nations pulled apart. Here, in this modest infirmary, the pattern repeated. A woman who once crawled backward in terror now rested with her hands unclenched. The soldiers who had lifted her without force now waited outside, not as victors, but as witnesses to a truth older than war. Conflict divides, propaganda blinds, fear isolates, but kindness, quiet, steady, unclaimed, moves differently. It does not erase the past, yet it softens its edges, proving in small, undeniable ways that humanity survives even the darkest years. And on this morning, remembered by few but felt by many, healing began where war once ruled.